Hi, I'm Sam, and I'm going to be doing a spotlight tour of the second part of Rasheed Araeen's retrospective that we have. I previously talked about level 2 downstairs, which is his early work in Karachi. Now this space is his sort of arrival in London and his practice from 1965 to 1982. So at this early point while he was in London, he was actually working as an engineer for British Petroleum. So these are a lot of his mechanical drawings that later informed his sculptures. And it is this idea of symmetrical and geometric. And Rasheed sort of follows this interest in symmetry because he thinks of it as having no hierarchy. So he's really experimenting a lot when he sort of comes to London, and he's pushing his practice, not just in galleries, but out into the world, and introduces it into nature. So this piece is titled BOO, which actually just stands for blue on orange. A lot of the titles seem quite cryptic, but they're really not. And this was in 1969, so he'd been in London for a few years producing artwork. And this was a really important piece because it was entered into the John Moore Painting Prize. And it caused a little bit of controversy at the time because people argued that it wasn't actually a painting, it was a sculpture. And he actually won second place for this, which he really thought was a starting point for his practice in England. He thought this was going to get him a lot of sort of recognition from galleries. But when he was approaching a lot of galleries, they were saying, we really do like your work and you're producing some really interesting things that not many people are producing right now, but we're only interested in showing European or Western artists, sorry. And this was sort of Rasheed's first experience of rejection because of his name or his race or where he was from. And this really started to feed into a lot of the practice that we'll see beyond this, because it started to get him interested in the political and the discrimination side of the art world in Europe. So this room is titled Becoming Political, and it sort of takes place from the early 70s onwards. This is where he really finds sort of a cause to talk about, using his artwork to express himself and express his feelings. So this is one of the first sort of political pieces that Rasheed involves himself with, and it's the story of David Olawale, who was an immigrant to Britain and who was the first and last black person who the police were found responsible for his death. So this is something that Rasheed got heavily involved with, and it's called Freedom News. And from 1972 onwards, he was actually part of the UK branch of Black Panthers and started to sort of get into writing and publishing, which carries on again throughout the space. So there's a lot of themes that become apparent as you walk around that will repeat and you'll see again. So this series was in 1975, and if you sort of tuned in at the first part, you'll see that his interest in fire came with burning tyres. So this series is called Burning Ties. He actually starts to introduce himself into the work. So this is the first instance where Rasheed becomes a part of the work. It's really showing the sort of progression of his practice, that he's starting to do performance photography. And the symbolism of burning the ties sort of stand for this Western formal culture, and it can also mean burning ties to each other, so you're burning the ties that exist. This series of self-portraits brings himself back into the work again, but through portraiture that you will see in the floor below. You've also still got the grid that he's known for, so it's portraits of himself, but sometimes his face is replaced with Urdu, which is his sort of native language of Karachi. So it gives a different context depending on who's looking at it. You've also got some sort of instances of Bar black sheep. So it'll say, yes sir, one bag full. So it's talking about these issues of race and this issue of that you're just there to please other people. And also this Urdu up the top that's repeated within each one. It says dance, so it's talking about whose tune are you dancing to. So it's this idea of, depending on who you are, depending on your background, you might be able to come and read all of this and take something completely different than if you can't read any of it. But that isn't necessary. You don't need to read what it says to understand the impact that he was trying to have with this series. This is quite an angry point for Rasheed. He's been doing this political work for about 10 years because it's 1982, and he's really starting to find a place of him in his work and carry that on with sort of the Urdu and his culture within it. So this has been the second part of the Rasheed Araeen retrospective. So make sure if you haven't seen the first part to check that out, because we talked about the early works that really inform some of the works on this floor, so you can really start to make links between the earliest parts of his practice and the later parts.